In the latest, North Korean leader Kim Jong Un has laid out plans for his country to ramp up the production of weapons-grade nuclear materials. This comes as the US Navy carrier strike group docked in South Korea on Tuesday. Also important to note that just a few days prior to this, North Korea claimed that it had tested an underwater drone that can unleash a radioactive tsunami. Kim Jong Un asserted on how the policy of expanding North Korea's arsenal is solely aimed at defending the country and regional peace and stability. Pyongyang has been ramping up military tests, firing short-range ballistic missiles, conducting a nuclear counter-attack simulation against US-South Korea drills. As tensions in the Korean peninsula remain high, the question that now arises is how real is the threat of a nuclear crisis? To discuss this, we have with us Professor Benoit Hardy-Chartrand, East Asian geopolitics and security analyst, joining us from Tokyo. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, North Korea plans to increase production of weapons-grade nuclear material. What can you tell us about this?
Well, this is something that we had been expecting and is certainly in line with the trends that we have witnessed in North Korea over the last couple of years. Ever since the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong Un, met with former President of the United States, Donald Trump, relationships between the two countries have been consistently declining to the point where tensions are extremely high at the moment. And over the last couple of years, North Korea has made tremendous efforts to increase its deterrent capabilities, increase the number of missile tests. 2022 was a record number of missile tests coming from North Korea. So this announcement today from North Korea that they want to increase the production of material that will make it easier for them to produce nuclear weapons does not particularly constitute a surprise, but certainly adds to the level of threat and complexity of this matter.
Right, absolutely. And just as I mentioned earlier, a few days ago, North Korea had claimed that it had tested a nuclear-capable underwater drone capable of creating a radioactive tsunami. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this test was, I would say, a little bit of a surprise, even though we do know that they are trying to increase the number of delivery methods, the different ways in which it can deliver and explode nuclear weapons. This particular kind of weapon is fairly rare. So that's why it came to a surprise to a lot of analysts and experts. Now, this particular weapon, however, it's important to mention that there is a degree of a skepticism regarding North Korea's capability to really detonate, to master this kind of technology. We have to understand that in the past, North Korea has, in some cases, exaggerated its capabilities. And of course, from the perspective of North Korea, it makes sense to try to appear like it is more advanced than it really is. This is all in line with its desire to make sure to deter the United States or any of its allies from attacking North Korea. So from that perspective, it makes sense for them to make some claims that might not be exactly accurate. And in the case of this underwater drone, we have not seen all the information about this. But if indeed they were to master this technology, this would be an obvious complicated threat. And the reason for this is anything that is underwater is relatively more difficult to detect. It is easier for North Korea to get close to the shores, to get close to its enemy targets without being detected, unlike other kinds of weapons like ballistic missiles, for example, that can be detected from the beginning. So this is why this particular test was surprising and concerning.
Right. Now, Kim Jong Un asserted on how the policy of expanding North Korea's arsenal is solely aimed at defending the country, regional peace and stability. That being said, how real do you think the threat of a nuclear crisis is?
I mean, it is a real threat. Let's make no mistake about that. But we also have to impress upon everyone the fact that North Korea does not intend to start a war. It does not intend to use nuclear weapons first. And the reason for that is North Korea is very well aware of its limited conventional capabilities. It is well aware that if it starts a war, a crisis, crisis that goes out of control, the American capabilities, along with the capabilities of American allies like Japan and South Korea, are much greater than North Korea. Therefore, if there were to be a war, it would very, very likely spell the end of the regime of Kim Jong Un. So that's why this is not in their intention. That being said, your question is very important because in a situation where there's a lot of tensions, in a situation where there's a lot of uncertainty, there can always be a degree of miscalculation, a mistake that creates a kind of unwanted crisis that it becomes very difficult to de-escalate from. So that's why the situation remains very concerning.
Right. That being said, plans to ramp up nuclear production exponentially came ahead of a U.S. Navy carrier strike group's scheduled arrival in South Korea, as I mentioned earlier. Now, what's your assessment of the United States' role in the simmering tensions in the Korean Peninsula?
Well, for the United States, maintaining a very strong and robust deterrence posture, meaning making sure that it has enough assets in the region to deter North Korea from conducting provocations or from starting a crisis or an armed conflict, is absolutely central to the United States. But also, let's remember that this is central to South Korea and Japan. Both of these countries are close allies of the United States. And both of these countries do want a strong American presence in the region because they largely depend on the United States for their security. However, to refer specifically to your question about the role of the United States in this crisis, there's no doubt that when we look at this from the North Korean perspective, the American presence in the region and his posture is precisely the reason why North Korea feels that it needs to protect itself in different ways. It does appear threatening for North Korea to see the United States that close, conducting exercises with its partners. So it's important to see it from both sides, but the American presence is certainly desired here by its partners.
Right, absolutely. In fact, I was just going to ask, how do you see the growing number of tests in recent years and what measures can be taken to reduce the North Korean leadership's proclivity to ever use nuclear weapons?
Yeah, it is certainly a proclivity that has increased. I mentioned a little bit earlier, in 2022 was an astounding number of nuclear tests from North Korea, almost 70 nuclear tests, which was 2 or 3 times higher than any previous years when it comes to the testing of ballistic missiles. Another I would say, threat, of course, is nuclear weapons testing. North Korea has conducted 6 nuclear tests so far. There are indications that it might be ready for a 7th nuclear test. Now, to your question as to how we can prevent that from happening, there's really not much that can be done. We have tried for about 30 years now to reduce the threat coming from North Korea. There has been several rounds of negotiations over the North Korean nuclear weapons program. So that's very difficult to fix. But if we look back at history, the moments where we had fewer tensions were the moments where there was engagement and there was some level of talks and discussions with North Korea. Now, it might appear like the current situation makes it difficult to talk to them, but if there were to be a little bit more dialogue, that would likely, at least momentarily, temporarily reduce the likelihood of any kind of crisis.
Right. Now, talking about dialogue, North Korea has passed a law allowing it to carry out preventive nuclear strike, declaring its status as a nuclear armed state irreversible. Now, that essentially means that chances of a dialogue are slim to none. So what would you say the North stands to gain by doing so?
No, absolutely. And your question is really, really relevant to this whole conversation. What can they gain? So North Korea indeed has proclaimed that it will not denuclearize. And I think everybody should right now be realistic about the prospects of denuclearization. It used to be it still is, in fact, the official goals of South Korea, of the United States, to reach full denuclearization. This is not going to happen. We have to make this clear. We have to treat North Korea now as a nuclear state, and that status is not going to change. However, for North Korea, if there were ever to be dialogue, and in fact, North Korea at different periods has tried to engage in dialogue, and what it wants, the reason it wants to engage in dialogue is to reduce or lift sanctions that are currently being imposed on North Korea. There are several rounds of sanctions, international sanctions, also sanctions that are unilateral coming from the US and Japan. And these sanctions have been hurting the North Korean economy significantly for several years. So North Korea, you can imagine a scenario where they might be willing to reduce a part of their arsenal, maybe dismantle some missiles in return for some degree of lifting of sanctions. But there's not going to be any kind of real denuclearization as we were hoping for many years.
All right. Now, in terms of expanding capabilities, what is your assessment of South Korea's position to defend itself as well as reduce the risk from the north?
Well, South Korea has been ever since the Korean War in 1950 to 1953, its whole defense apparatus, its whole defense posture has been geared towards north because, frankly, for South Korea, the only real threat comes from North Korea. Therefore, its defense capabilities are quite robust. It receives a lot of help from the United States, buys a lot of weapons from the United States. Let's add to this, let's remind everyone that there are 28,500 American troops that are based in South Korea. Therefore, its preparedness, its position in terms of being able to repel any kind of attack, any kind of conflict, any kind of provocation from North Korea are quite robust, and they continue to be developed. They continue to add new weapons, including missile defense capabilities like THAAD a few years ago, which is an American defense system. So they're always going to be to make sure to be on the forefront of new weapons development, new missile defense development, because of that ever-present threat from North Korea that is not going to go away anytime soon.
All right. Well, Professor, thank you so much for joining us with all your insights on this.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.